All right, folks, I will adjust. Welcome to Fact and Fiction, Transgender Issues in the Real World and Through the Prism of Fiction with Robin Geigel and Jean Locicero. There we go, I got it on the second try. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. So welcome to our in-person audience and our online audience. The short explanation for our lengthy name is that we are a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And this is the service we provide, is holding this room for queer culture. So I'm going to first read a land acknowledgement, and then we're going to introduce our speakers and get started. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are actively seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. And we hope to make an announcement about this partnership in the near future. But in the meantime, we encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. And now I will introduce our author and guest, and we'll get started. So Robin Geigel is the author of the Aaron McCabe Legal Thrillers and an attorney, speaker, and activist who has been honored by the ACLU-NJ and the NJ Pride News Network for her work on behalf of the LGBTQ community. Appointed by the New Jersey Supreme Court to the court's Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, she's practiced law for more than 40 years, representing clients in state and federal courts. She is active in the New Jersey State Bar Association, where she is a member of the Women in the Profession section and a past chair of the bar's LGBT rights section. She also is a member of the board of directors of Garden State Equality, New Jersey's largest LGBTQ+ civil rights organization. A frequent lecturer on diversity issues, she lives in New Jersey and can be found online at robingeigel.com or on Twitter at robingeigel. And Jean Locicero is the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey. She supervises the litigation program and related advocacy of the ACLU-NJ's legal department and manages its 10+ person staff. Jean joined the ACLU-NJ as a staff attorney in 2004 and served as its deputy legal director for 10 years prior to becoming legal director in 2018. She has litigated and advocated in a wide range of civil rights and civil liberties cases with a focus on prison conditions, racial equity, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and reproductive health. She recently served on New Jersey's Transgender Equality Task Force, is a trustee of the Association of Federal Bar of New Jersey, and serves on other legal and policy committees. Jean started her legal career as a legal fellow at the ACLU of Alabama after graduating with highest honors from Rutgers School of Law, Newark. She spent 3 years in private practice before joining the ACLU New Jersey. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. And it is truly my honor to be here with Jean to talk about these issues today. Jean and I had the honor of working with Jean in the ACLU of New Jersey on a landmark case in New Jersey that we will discuss at some length. And as Greg said, I am also an author of the Aaron McCabe series. The first book, By Way of Sorrow, came out in 2021, and the second book, Survivor's Guilt, came out 2022, and as of Tuesday, here's book 3. Remain Silent, which all feature criminal defense attorney Erin McCabe and her law partner Dwayne Swisher. So we thought what we would do, this is totally unscripted, we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants here, is that I would do a short reading from Remain Silent because it gives a nice segue into the main issue that we want to talk about today in terms of transgender people and what happens to them when they're incarcerated. So this is from the very beginning of Remain Silent. And I should mention that although they are all in the Erin McCabe series, they are all written as standalone novels, so you do not have to read by way of sorrow or survivor's guilt to understand Remain Silent. And as you will see, I give the characters some backstory to the characters right in the beginning. Chapter 1, Wednesday, May 27th, 2009, 10:30 a.m. Erin eyed the camera in the corner of the ceiling. After almost 12 years as a criminal defense lawyer, she had been in enough interrogation rooms to know that it probably wasn't the only one focused on her. She brushed her copper-colored hair back off her face, willing her expression to conceal the emotions roiling inside. She glanced to her left at her law partner, Dwayne Swisher, hoping to find some solace in his commanding appearance. But as she studied his face, she found it inscrutable. Dwayne, who had spent 7 years as an FBI special agent, had mastered many tricks during his time at the Bureau, one of them being the art of hiding whatever he was thinking. The door to the room suddenly swung open, and a man swaggered in, followed closely by a woman. Ms. McCabe, Mr. Switcher, I'm Detective Adam Lanza with the Cape May County Prosecutor's Office. We spoke yesterday, and this is Detective Emily Carter with the Avalon Police Department, he said, extending his hand and shaking Dwayne and Erin's hands in turns, with Carter then following suit. Lanza looked to be in his early 30s with close cropped black hair and brown eyes. His broad shoulders and barrel chest certainly looked like the byproducts of many hours in the gym. Carter appeared slightly older, mid-40s perhaps, her brown hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Despite the fact that Carter was there to interrogate her, Erin was immediately curious about Carter's backstory. It wasn't easy for women in law enforcement. So if Erin's guesstimate of Carter's age was close, it meant she had gone through the police academy when there were very few women recruits. Thanks for coming in, Lanza said, dropping a folder on the table in front of him before sitting opposite them. Thanks for coming in, Erin thought. Not like you gave me much choice. Lanza folded his arms across his chest. You're both experienced lawyers, so let me be clear. Ms. McCabe, you have the right to leave anytime you'd like. This is not a custodial interrogation. We're just trying to gather information on the murder of Bradford Montgomery. Dwayne leaned forward in his chair, narrowing the space between himself and Lanza. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a hard body, Dwayne's size was imposing, a fact that he wasn't afraid to use to his advantage. Since we are, as you said, experienced lawyers, Dwayne said, I would likewise presume that you and Detective Carter are experienced detectives. So let's lay our cards on the table, shall we? We're in the county prosecutor's office in one of your interrogation rooms, meaning this is all being video recorded and probably monitored by others sitting in another room. Your preamble about Ms. McCabe being free to leave is just your way to avoid providing her with her Miranda rights. This way you can claim it wasn't a custodial interrogation, which means that if you so choose, you can cherry pick her words and use them against her. Dwayne stroked his goatee and leaned back. You think Ms. McCabe is somehow involved in Mr. Montgomery's death? Let's just say she's a person of interest, Lanza responded. Let's just say, Dwayne said, feeding Lanza's words back to him. Legally, there's no such thing as a person of interest. Detective, either Ms. McCabe's a suspect or she's not. And we both know there's different ramifications. Erin watched her partner, still trying to adjust to her unexpected role in this unfolding drama. She was supposed to be the one fencing with the detectives, parrying the lunges at her client, but not today. In this morning's performance, the part of Erin McCabe will be played by Dwayne Swisher, she thought. And yet, as much as she hated being the understudy, there was no one she trusted more than Dwayne. He was not only her partner, he was her best friend. When he left the Bureau 6 years ago, he could have gone anywhere, but to Erin's surprise, he agreed to become her partner, and together they started the firm of McCabe and Swisher. Of course, at the time, Erin was still living as Ian McCabe. A year after they formed the firm, Erin had come out as a transgender woman, and even though some of Dwayne's friends had given him a hard time for staying partners with the tranny, Dwayne hadn't wavered, and the firm and the friendship had flourished. Mr. Swisher, we can put Ms. McCabe in Mr. Montgomery's home about the time of the murder. Perhaps Ms. McCabe has an explanation for that. Perhaps she doesn't. I'm going to skip a little bit in the interest of time, but let's just say that the dialogue continues. As Carter jotted the number down, Lonza opened the file in front of him and slid several photographs across the table to Erin. Do you recognize these? Erin looked at the photographs. First group of photos appeared to be dated, having an almost vintage quality to their appearance, perhaps copied from some website or publication of some sort. The others were more recent. Erin had seen law enforcement surveillance photos in any number of cases. These had the same feel. Surveillance photos taken with a telephoto lens. They were all of a woman, and as Erin studied them, she realized all of the photos probably depicted the same woman, each group separated by several decades. I've never seen these before, she answered. Do you recognize the person in the photos, Lonza asked. Erin glanced down at the photos. I don't believe I've ever seen this person before, she replied, looking up at Lonza. What if I told you they were all pictures of Bradford Montgomery dressed as a woman? She looked down at the pictures again, and then back to Lonza. Okay, she said. Okay, what? He said accusingly. Okay, nothing, she responded. I met Mr. Montgomery once for less than an hour. That's the only time I've ever seen him. He was dressed in khakis and a golf shirt. You're telling me these are pictures of him dressed as a woman? I'll accept your representation. It doesn't change the fact that I've never seen these before. Don't you find it strange that Mr. Montgomery is found dead after meeting with you, a well-known transgender, and pictures of him dressed as a woman suddenly surface? Erin cringed at Lonza's misuse of the word transgender as a noun, but she knew this was not the right time to be pandemic. Pedantic. We deal with a lot of pandemics. Detective, I find it strange that Mr. Montgomery had been murdered, period, full stop. But I can assure you these pictures have nothing to do with me. We have reason to believe that you, probably at the behest of others, were trying to blackmail him with these photos because of his involvement in Arnold Welch's campaign for governor. What do you say to that? Erin stared at Lonza, suddenly aware of what it felt like for her clients. She lost count of the number of times she had watched an interrogation video in disbelief as a client, sitting in a room just like this one, tried to talk their way out of the jam they were in. And each time she'd scream at the screen, shut up, take the fifth, you idiot. But they rarely did. And on those rare occasions when they did, it was usually too late. Now she understood the temptation, the feeling that all she had to do was explain what happened. Then they'd understand their mistake. Then she'd be done with all this. But that was a fool's errand. What do I say? I say, I think you're crazy, detective, she finally said. That, and I think it's time for me to go. Dwayne pushed his chair back from the table. Unless you have a warrant for Ms. McCabe's arrest, we'll be leaving now. Erin held her breath, waiting to see if they had a warrant. She didn't think so. Otherwise, they would have Mirandized her. But Lonza struck her as someone who didn't always color inside the lines, making the sudden appearance of a warrant possible. If you leave now, you'll be missing your one and only opportunity, Ms. McCabe, to come clean and work out a deal. Lonza snapped Dwayne, then turned to Erin. Your story doesn't hold water, McCabe. The only cell phone found at Montgomery's house was in his living room, and there was no incoming calls or text messages between 6 and 9:30. So where's the phone that you say he got the calls on? Don't engage, she thought. As crazy as it seemed, Lanza appeared to truly believe she had killed Montgomery. And it was clear from his demeanor that nothing good was going to come out of further conversations. Lanza pointed his finger at Erin. Prison life can be really tough on people like you. If you cooperate, tell us who you're working with, we can make it easier. Make it so you do your time at Edna Mahan, the women's prison. But if you walk out the door, all bets are off. Who knows? Maybe you'll wind up at Northern State or East State. The guys there will have a lot of fun with you. She glared at him, trying to ignore his comments and focus on what was important. They didn't have a warrant, so they weren't arresting her. She moved her chair back from the table and stood. Lanza's smirk quickly morphed into a scowl, the veins in his neck pulsating noticeably. Remember, McCabe, the train is leaving the station. This is your one and only opportunity to get on board. The next time I won't call and invite you down for a talk. I'll show up with cuffs. You understand that? She tried not to roll her eyes at the number of cliches being thrown at her. Have a nice day, Dwayne said, then gently took Erin's arm and steered her around the table, heading towards the door. Lanza stood up from his chair and hurried over to block their way. I meant what I said, McCabe. I'll have fun watching you sit in the men's jail. I have to admit that for a guy, you're pretty attractive. I'm sure all the guys in state prison will be happy to see you. It's Ms. McCabe to you, Detective, Erin said. And as far as your threats, she walked around him, opened the door, and looked back over her shoulder. You can go fuck yourself.
I can't wait to read the next chapter.
But the reason why, obviously it's the first chapter, but it's a good segue into what Jean and I are going to talk about today. Because as I said, back in 2019, Jean honored me with a phone call. I was in my office one day and Jean called me and she said, Robin, we're about to start a case involving a inmate that's being held, I forget where, Sonia?
Northern State.
Was it Northern State? Yeah. She's a trans woman and she's being held at the men's prison. And we're going to start a lawsuit to try to get her transferred to the women's prison. And we'd like you to be part of the team. And what a team it was. So Jean, why don't you give more of the backstory, because Jean has been working on prisoners' rights cases as long as I've known her, which is I think around 2009, and certainly on issues impacting trans prisoners and trans inmates, trans people in custody since that time.
Thanks, Robin. And first of all, I'd like to just thank everybody for having this terrific event. I'm really honored to be here with Robin. I love her books, and I hope everyone watching buys them because they're just real page turners. And I really feel honored to partner with you in a lot of this work. So I called Robin. I think I'd actually called you before I invited you to join the team. I think I was probably calling Robin a lot saying, I need some guidance here. So I'll just back up and say that I came to the ACLU of New Jersey in 2004. And at that time I did start, prisoners' rights has been an issue that I've cared deeply about, and the ACLU cares deeply about, for decades. And we were hearing from trans people who were inside jails and prisons for years. And the legal, the paths to trying to make conditions better are really limited. And let me just back up and say, our prison system, I practice in New Jersey, but I think it's true that across the country, our prisons are not designed, are designed to inflict pain, not honor and respect people. They're racist. They're, people come out with a lot of trauma as a result of prisons, and that's all by choice, the kinds of resources, all of it. And so part of what we do at the ACLU is try to keep people out of prison and, limit mass, end mass incarceration. But we also know that there are going to be people inside who want to fight for their dignity and rights. And so over the years, I've met with several trans people who've been incarcerated. And it's always really hard because the way the statutes work, there's this federal law called the Prism Litigation Reform Act, and it really makes it very hard, like almost impossible to bring lawsuits on behalf of people. There's so many barriers. And trans people inside are particularly vulnerable, and it can be really risky to assert your rights when you're in prison, because you can, prison administrators have, and corrections officers have a lot of power and discretion to make lives difficult. And so even, it can just be putting yourself out there to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit is already difficult. And then when you're from a vulnerable community, it's just magnified. So it's been hard to think of like legal paths to try to make conditions better. And then in 2018, I guess, the Transgender Equality Task Force came to be. I mentioned it in my biography, and I was put on the committee that was focused on policing in prisons. And as part of that work, I started reaching out to people inside and to supporters outside to find out, to learn about the trans community inside more directly, and started meeting with people. And so I had, you know, by happenstance, I had this chance to meet the person who would become our client, Sonia Doe. And so we went in just kind of as with an informational interview in mind. And she had been really active advocating for herself inside. And just to give you a little bit of background about Sonia, she had transitioned came out as a trans woman in 2003 and in her early 20s, and was being started getting treatment in 2005 or 6. And so fast forward, it's 2018 or early 2019 that I meet her. Was the pandemic, right? The time frame goes away. So I met her in, I think it was March of 2019. She'd been inside at that point for like a year, a little over a year. And when she came in, she, you know, there was no, it was very clear to the Department of Corrections that she is a woman, and her county jail record said she was a woman, her driver's license, like there was just no doubt they knew her gender identity, and but they still placed her in the men's prison, and she was suffering because of that. She had experienced violence and harassment and like just unrelenting indignities. It was a terrible time for her, and as it is for so many trans people inside. And she had some support outside, and she was somebody who just had like this fire within her to really push against the suffering that she was experiencing, and push back and fight for her rights. And so after meeting with her, we kind of thought about it, and there were a couple of things that kind of came together. And one of them is that, so we're in New Jersey State Prison. In her case, she was getting the medical care she needed. In a lot of cases, medical care can be a real hurdle. And so we were able to kind of think about this case just when it came to, are they recognizing and honoring her gender identity? And so we started thinking about using New Jersey's anti-discrimination laws. Now, anti-discrimination laws in states usually cover a couple key areas: housing, employment, and public accommodations. Now, public accommodations are places like bookstores and any store you can think of, and pools and doctor's offices, and any place that generally invites the public. But jails and prisons is like a big question mark in some, or it was. And there was starting to be a little bit of door opening on whether our state prison system would be considered subject to the law against discrimination as a public accommodation. So that was one kind of area that was starting to develop, that we were able to say, like, we're gonna try this. And and then the other thing that happened is in 2007, a lot of trans activists have been working for a long time to make sure that our law against discrimination actually protected against gender identity explicitly. So we had this good law, we were trying to make it apply to the prisons, and then we had this woman who was ready to fight. And so kind of the stars really aligned at that point. And so we came back to her and we said, you were giving us some feedback about the policies and things we could change, regulation wise, but what do you think about really pushing the prison to recognize your gender identity and make sure that you're at the women's prison? And so she was game, and that was a real, kind of moment. So our colleague Tess Borden, who hi, if you're watching, did a lot of the legwork, really thinking through the legal theories in this case and meeting with Sonia and kind of making sure we have her story, because we had to bring this into court, and we didn't want it to be just about her. We wanted to tell the broader story about trans people and their vulnerability in society at large, but in particular when they're incarcerated. And so it was a big undertaking, and so then we were able to kind of marshal all these facts and get the complaint together. And it was, I think, in May, there was this incident at the prison where Sonia was, I think that, we were meeting with her and they knew, and she was taken into a room to be asked questions. And she asserted her gender identity. She said, I'm a woman, and they violently responded and beat her up. And it was actually Memorial Day weekend of that F-19. It was really horrifying because she experienced all of this violence. And so, her face was messed up and really terrible. And then on top of that, they charged her with assaulting the officers, right? So they instigated this incident, this violence against her, and then charged her and put her in solitary confinement. So we kind of had to put everything we were working on hold for a second to kind of deal with this intense moment in her life where she's in solitary confinement, she's been beat up, she's now being subject to all kinds of discipline, including she'd earned good time credits to reduce her sentence, and she'd earned 9 months off of her sentence, and they were taking that away from her. They were putting her in, all of these disciplinary sanctions. And so Tess jumped into action, and we filed an appeal. We kept appealing the sanctions against her because we wanted her out of solitary, because we knew that solitary confinement for any amount of time it's extreme isolation and can be really damaging to people. And so we were able to get an appellate court to put her back into general population while the charges were pending, and kind of put a hold on that. And then we were able to kind of resolve that later on. But so it was just a very intense summer that we were working on all of this, and we're able to finally file in August of 2019. And when we filed our complaint, part of what we then filed with the court was this motion to say, here's our complaint, it's 48 pages long, and we've got 11 or 12 things we want you to rule in our favor on, but here's this one thing you can do right now, which is order her transferred to the women's prison. And fortunately, we had an attorney general and a Department of Corrections that kind of saw the writing on the wall, I think, and were within 2 weeks of filing the complaint, they agreed to transfer her. So we didn't even need the judge to rule on that motion. They agreed to transfer her to the women's prison.
Yeah, and I think there was some political implications. Governor Murphy was an elected governor at that point, and I think he had part of his political platform was being friendly to LGBTQ plus issues, and so here his administration was faced with this issue. And so, I think that was something that we were able to exploit in terms of we had an attorney general appointed by a governor who was going to be somewhat more friendly to some of the issues that you raised.
That's fair. That was another star that kind of aligned, which is that prison litigation, I was involved in a case that lasted 10 years. It can last, and I'm in another case right now that's 5 or 6 years. And so it can really be a long, tremendous slog. And so when they're fighting you tooth and nail, and at every step of the way. And so in this case, we really did have this great political moment to bring them to the table to really think about what a meaningful settlement could look like.
Right. And I have to say, Jean put together, and I'm assuming it's you because you're the legal director, but just put together a tremendous team. She mentioned Tess Borden, and Tess is just this amazing lawyer who's so smart and just a joy to work with. And there was Jean, who I've known since, 2008, 2009, something like that. And then Alex Sloan, who is just, when you need a hammer in the room, you call on Alex. I was kind of the window dressing, I think. I do think that I lended something to, not necessarily from a legal perspective, but as a trans woman, I think the attorneys from the Attorney General's office were kind of in a box, because how could they say something about Sonia that they wouldn't say about me? And so in that sense, I do think maybe, in terms of my role in the case, that it was putting a human face on it, even though they weren't looking at Sonia, they were looking at me. And I think that helped.
It may have, yeah. I mean, another thing I thought you really brought to the team was you worked as a defense attorney for the government before. And so you had this terrific insight into what, defense attorneys might be thinking. And that was really valuable, especially during the settlement period.
Yeah, and as Jean mentioned, so we bring the lawsuit, we get the immediate relief, which is what we wanted, and then again, talking about things aligning, it didn't seem it initially at the time, but the corrections officers union brought a separate lawsuit claiming that having trans women in the facility would create problems, because how were they going to search them, and what were they going to do, and this was unfair, and it was a violation of the union contract. And so we wound up in this situation when they brought the separate lawsuit, where the Attorney General, who was our adversary in our case, was now on our side in terms of the union's lawsuit. And even though we weren't technically parties to it, I think that the fact that they were on our side in that lawsuit, was enormous, and they took a really strong position. They said, no, you as the union don't have any role in this. This is law that gets decided by the Department of Corrections or the Attorney General's office. And we had a very good judge,
yes.
Judge Hurd, in Mercer County, and he made very short shrift of the corrections officer's lawsuit, and that helped bring everybody to the table.
It did. Yeah, it was wild that the officers just suddenly thought they had a right to say, that trans women couldn't be in the women's prison. And their arguments were just so bogus, because they were already dealing with trans prisoners. They just weren't, it was really frustrating, but also did put us in this very unique position where we're at the same table with the Attorney General in that case. So so this case kind of went through, it was kind of sprawling at one point between the disciplinary and the union lawsuit, and then the main lawsuit, which was at the heart of it. And so one other tremendous thing about Sonia Doe in this case was that she'd suffered, and we were seeking damages for her, which is money in lawsuits, right? But she was really driven to change the policies at the prison. And so one thing, and was very involved in the settlement negotiations. She wanted them to result in a changed policy, because one of the things that happened actually is that the Department of Corrections had this policy on gender identity that existed in I think they put it in place in 2017. So this is 2019. And when we meet with her, we tell her about this policy. She has never seen this policy. And the policy actually suggests that they will take gender identity into account when housing, but what they were actually doing was taking physiology into account, right? Like, so it didn't matter, anything about, you can have all of these proofs or whatever about gender identity. They were going to ignore that. And if you hadn't medically transitioned, they were just not gonna put you in the women's prison. So that was what was actually happening in spite of what policy they had. And then they weren't even telling their trans prisoners that this policy existed. So it had all of these, processes in place, and nobody even knew that they could avail, could ask for reconsideration. And so part of what Sonia was fighting for was to make sure people knew about, there was a good policy in place, people knew about it, and they could, get the care and the placement that was appropriate for them.
And it was interesting because as Jean said, this was filed the end August of 19. Then we have the corrections officer's lawsuit, and that takes a while. And basically what the Attorney General's office said was, okay, well, let's see if we can negotiate a settlement. We won't even file an answer in this lawsuit. So, and again, the judge, we had Judge Hurd in the case, the same judge who heard the corrections officer's case. And he was, okay, I'll give you time to try to settle it. That's good. And then of course, along comes the pandemic in the middle of these discussions, and it made things go probably a lot longer than we would have hoped. But our main goal, and as Jean said, Sonia, to her credit, it was about changing the policies, and that's what the settlement negotiations really focused on. It wasn't focused on the money and the attorney's fees and things like that. It was making a better policy and making sure that that policy was enforced.
Right, and that people knew that they could have, that there was a process and they could make appeal decisions and all of that. And another part of the settlement too was to make sure that the disciplinary charges, she got her time back, and that went away. So that was, so for us, we were thinking we want her out as soon as possible, and we want a good policy in place for people who were there and coming after her. So the implementation of the policy, just to be candid, hasn't been as great as we hoped. What we can say is that I think just a couple of months after she moved to Edna, which is a women's prison, they transferred several other trans women to the women's prison. I think they didn't handle that as, like, there wasn't a lot of cultural training or educating people, officers and people inside, about the changes. And so there have, we heard about some conflicts and things happening. And we now, from what I'm hearing from folks, there are still a lot of folks, I don't know how many, but some number of trans women in the women's prison. But we also are hearing a lot about trans women who are in men's prisons still, where their identities not being honored, or their request to be at the women's prison isn't being followed. And so we're kind of digging into that. It's hard, it took enormous resources to represent this one person and get this policy. And so then, we're trying to keep an eye on how it's being implemented, and it can be really hard to kind of keep track of all of the ways it shakes out in the end. But I know there are a lot of good advocates out there keeping an eye on things. And one thing we should also say, I guess, is that the women's prison in New Jersey is kind of notorious, has had terrible abuse scandals there over the years. And so what we actually did have to have conversations about, you're getting transferred to a place where we know that people have been harmed. And so, we just need you to be aware that you'll be based on your gender identity, but know that there were federal charges against officers. There's a lot of violence that has been documented.
It wasn't like they were going to a club fed or anything like that.
Yeah,
It was
no.
still a very, very nasty place to be incarcerated. It's interesting, kind of backing up a little bit, to the prequel to the story. By Way of Sorrow, which is my first book, I had started writing that in probably 2015, 2016. And in that book, one of the main characters is a young Black trans woman who is a sex worker who is incarcerated. I deal with, some of the themes that some of these people have to deal with when they're incarcerated in a men's prison. And it was before the Sonia Doe case. And so it was just interesting that here I am writing fiction, and By Way of Sorrow was acquired by Kensington Books in December of 2018. So before Jean even brought this to my attention, but it was one of those, quirky things where here I was writing about this and written a book where part of the story is this young trans woman who's incarcerated in a men's prison and what is happening to her as a result. And then all of a sudden I'm thrust into this real life situation. And so, one of the things that I like to do when I write the Aaron McCabe series is they're legal thrillers. But, so I want people who enjoy legal thrillers to buy them. They're not necessarily written for an LGBTQ plus audience. They're written for more of a cis audience. But I try to, at the same time, it's my Mary Poppins spoonful of sugar approach to writing, which is I give people what they want, which is that thriller, but then I'm trying to educate them a little bit about the issues that trans people face. And it was just pure coincidence that one of the issues that I dealt with in the first book was what happens when trans women are incarcerated in a men's prison. It's not the central theme to the story, but it's part of the story and part of Sharice's story. And so, then fast forward, I get this call from Jean and I'm like, whoa.
Fiction to fact.
Yeah, really. I can't say enough about what the ACLU is doing in terms of not only these issues, but in terms of LGBTQ plus issues writ large. I always feel guilty when I call Jean because I'll be like, I know you have a million things on your plate, but there's this Board of Education that's doing this, or, can you do this over here? And again, to their credit, there might be times where they can't do exactly what I'd like them to do, but they're always there to help out. And, again, it's no secret that the world we're living in right now is a crazy place. And Jean heard me speak Tuesday at my launch party about the fact that, the ACLU is tracking over 450 bills across the country aimed at LGBTQ plus people and primarily against trans people. And it's the ACLU and other organizations like them that, are pushing back and fighting for our rights. So if this kind of sounds a little bit like an infomercial for the ACLU, it is because, look, the Sonia Doe case, folks there did amazing work and got an amazing result. We sometimes, when we were negotiating, and I don't know that I'm giving away any trade secrets here, but we'd be like, can we really get this? Because as Jean said, it was, we were in uncharted territory. And I remember the first time Jean called me to talk about it. And I said, okay, but how are we going to get the law against discrimination to apply? And she said, public accommodations. And I said, Jean, they try to keep people out of prison. Nobody wants to be there. It doesn't sound like a public accommodation to me. And she referred me to a case, and a couple of cases, and I read them, and damn if she wasn't right. And that issue, the AG's office never even tried to litigate it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth noting that, so New Jersey is one of still a handful of states that actually recognizes gender identity when housing people. And so there's still across the country so many people being housed in not in accordance with their gender identity, and I'm sure suffering because of that. So, we're kind of, in a better place than than we were, and then other states are, but there's still so much we need to do, especially for folks inside. And, another thing, 2019 also felt like a different time than it is today.
Yeah.
Like things have gotten so much worse culturally, and the fights are about so much more now. And so just thankful for all of the folks who are my colleagues at the National ACLU and here at NICLU in New York and across the country who are fighting these battles. And of course, all of the great trans rights organizations like National Center for Transgender Equality and Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. There's so many organizations to support who are fighting for basic rights.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I hadn't put that one into the database in terms of, yeah, it was 2019. If we were bringing the same case today, even with the exact same administration in place in New Jersey, I'm not sure how we would fare, because I think politicians of all stripes have gotten a little bit leery of taking sides on LGBTQ plus issues. You know, like, is there going to be a political calculus that I'm going to pay for coming out in support of something like this? Or I mean, I will say Governor Murphy continues to be great on these issues. So I'd like to think we'd come out in the same place, but it certainly is a far different environment from where we were back then. And look, I mentioned it the other night, as of July 1st, as a trans woman, if I fly to Florida and land at some airport, Orlando International Airport, I can't use the bathroom in the airport because as of July 1 in Florida, you have to use the bathroom in accordance with the sex you were assigned at birth. That's what they're doing to people like me. Can you imagine what they're doing to the people that are incarcerated in their prisons? Because again, you know, there's a hierarchy, whether we like it or not, in terms of the way people are treated, and certainly people who are incarcerated are treated far worse than those of us on the outside. So if that's what they're doing to me and other trans people, I can't imagine how Florida is treating their trans prisoners. So what else we have? Questions from anyone?
Where is Sonia today?
She's out and doing well.
Good.
So I actually just
Good.
saw her recently. So,
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's nice to hear.
I mean, one of the positive impacts, if there were any positive impacts as a result of the pandemic, is that a lot of people who were incarcerated had you know, some of their time taken off so that they could be released earlier. And unfortunately, as Jean said, the ACLU was successful in the repeal of the disciplinary proceedings. And then as a result of good time credits and then the pandemic, Sonia did get out a little bit early.
Yeah.
So she's out, doing well, and you know, still fighting the fight.
Yeah. I mean, just to
That's
say,
right.
she was just such a tremendous, generous person about this too. We were able, you know, to we did press releases about this and we're able to talk about this publicly, and she had some photos taken of her, and I'm just so grateful for her willingness to share her story and to be out front and really fighting for these issues, because it's an extraordinary, it can be a real burden on folks, and it takes extraordinary strength, and so just, you know, want to give her all the props on that.
Yeah, but I mean, without you and the team from the ACLU, I mean,
Just the lawyers. I mean, you need the.
you need the clients, but you need the lawyers too. And you know, you folks put together a brilliant team. Did really good legal work on this. I mean, when the other side doesn't even want to file an answer, you know you're doing good work. And you know, some credit has to go also to our adversaries, the attorneys from the Attorney General's office, who you know, they had a client to represent, the Department of Corrections, but they were reasonable. They understood the legal position that we had put them in. They could have fought. They could have, you know, made it an ugly case. They didn't. They ultimately did the right thing, because it takes two parties to settle a case. And so, you know, give some props to them as well, because they were basically a good team on their side as well, who helped get to a good resolution, not only for Sonia, but for the trans inmates in New Jersey. As Jean said, unfortunately, you know, we're seeing some things that kind of make us a little queasy in terms of what's going on. But again, we have a good policy, and if we can get Department of Corrections to enforce it and do what's right, the people in New Jersey, the trans population that's facing incarceration will be in a better place.
And parallel, we're gonna keep fighting to make sure our prisons and jails populations are shrinking
Right.
and keep as many people with their families as possible.
Anything else, folks? We cover everything for you. Things that you're going, oh, I wish they had talked about this. Yeah, and no spoilers, but some issues involving incarcerated people do come up and remain silent. So little teaser out there for anybody that wants to get it.
Well, and I appreciate the way you talk about the criminal legal system. In the prior books, I haven't remained silent yet, but
what? It came out Tuesday?
I know. But one of the things I appreciate about it is like there's this legal thriller part, and as Robin mentioned, she's also educating the public, and we got a little piece of that in the reading where you talk about transgenders and that. But there's so many. I love the opportunities you take to kind of bring the reader along with the trans experience, and so thank you. I made sure my mom read the book.
Well, thank you, Jean. And again, look, I'm a trans woman, but I recognize my privileges, and I have a ton of privileges. And so I recognize that I kind of have a unique platform, and there's not too many of us who are out there writing legal thrillers or writing mystery or crime novels who are trans. I mean, two that I know of, but nobody else who's doing legal thrillers. And so the ability to put it into the context of the legal world and how these issues impact people legally as well as just in real life is something that I feel that I'm honored to kind of present, because I do have this unique position and maybe the opportunity to speak for people that don't have the ability to speak for themselves because of their own situations. And so I take it seriously. I try my hardest to make sure I get everything right, both from a trans person's lived experience, because again, I'm a 70-year-old trans person. I don't have the lived experience of a 19-year-old trans woman, and certainly not of a Black trans woman. So I strive really hard to make sure I get those things right. I engage other people to help me and make sure I'm getting it right. And so it's important for me to not only convey that lived experience correctly, but to convey the legal experience correctly. Because I don't want somebody distracted by the fact that they go, oh, that's not the way. There's nothing worse than watching a TV show and going, oh, that doesn't happen in real life. So I take that responsibility seriously as an attorney and as a trans person, and go figure where I came up with Aaron McCabe, a transgender criminal defense attorney coming from a transgender former criminal defense attorney. So,
with some Jersey flair.
with some, yeah, if you're not from Jersey, you miss kind of some of the little subtleties. Throw in some local flavor from time to time, but don't worry, you won't miss it all.
Great. Thank you both so much.
No, thank you so much for having us. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here. And thank you, all of you, for watching.
Yay. Thank you everyone who joined us online. Have a lovely night.